Well, hello, dear friends, and welcome back to the basement library where interesting and sometimes odd conversations are had. Today, I am very, very pleased and thrilled to have Dr. Vigen Guroian here with me to talk about his new book, or rather, the second edition of his old book. But reading it a second time, it feels just as new as the first time. Tending the Heart of Virtue. Thank you, Dr. Guroian, for providing me with a copy of this lovely little book, and thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here.
Sure.
It is an honor because, as I've told some of my readers and Patreon supporters, the first edition of Tending the Heart of Virtue was one of those books that, whether I like it or not, becomes a foundation for my sort of creative world, became a foundation for my creative worldview. And I honestly think that if I hadn't read it, I wouldn't have started to write myself. So a great personal thank you for the book, because it really helped direct me, along with the stories that I grew up with. So it was a fitting companion for the experience of having the stories told me as a child. And I honestly think it was a huge step in putting me on the path of being a writer.
Very
Yeah,
gratifying.
So when I found out from Oxford Press that you were looking for people to talk to about the new book, I was very, very happy to extend the invitation into this room.
Expanded considerably, so
yeah,
that's why we thought we should relaunch it.
Yes, and I'm so glad you did. It reads not at all dated, and I think that as a kind and calm voice, written in a voice perhaps more appropriate to 25 years ago, it's a really lovely entry back into a world that's now yelling at a world of people yelling at each other about culture war type things. So I wanted to thank you for that, for the calm and kind voice behind it all.
That's a very important observation, because I had the opportunity, and I did take the opportunity to go through the entire book and edit. Most of it was wording and some archaic speech that referred to my children as children and not as adults and so forth. But I could have in the first chapter started in on a culture warrior's path, but I don't think it's very fruitful.
I agree.
Book primarily, though I took to task some of the literary critics, but
that's okay. That's okay. You can do that.
Yeah.
I think in this room we'll all be in agreement with that, and some of the psychologists as well. But those are very fitting criticisms, I think, because these are tendencies that are not simply present in academia, but are spilling out into the larger culture and are having some really unpleasant ramifications on the larger culture, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit today.
Right.
But before we get there, I wanted to talk to you about your grandmother. In the acknowledgments, you talk about your grandmother and how important she was to your love of fairy stories and storytelling in general. I'm afraid, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm afraid that we're entering a time when grandmothers will no longer have the kind of cultural background to be able to tell stories at all. I'm not sure we're there yet, but I think we're getting there soon. I think that when my generation becomes grandparents, I think a lot of us will not have the stories to tell even. And maybe even if we do have them, we might not have the perceive that we have the time to tell them because we're so busy with all these important things that we're doing.
I think
And
you're right. Unfortunately, you're correct on that score. That's, that's true.
so, so what do
Unfortunately.
you think? What do you think the future holds then? And how perhaps maybe the doom and gloom, that's my Russian is coming out, but maybe the better question is how might we go about educating ourselves in the tales if we didn't get them, if we in the absence of good grandmothers.
Well, let me talk about my grandmother first. Now, her name was Zabel Kasayan. Zabel is Elizabeth in Armenian.
Hmm.
Yes, she grew up in eastern Turkey, which was once historic Armenia. Um, and yes, she knew many tales, not just Armenian tales, but shared tales of that region. And one particular character, Turkish character called Nesreddin Hoca, and many of her stories were about him. And I thought this man could not possibly exist, though I was convinced that he did exist in a village or city, actually.
Yeah.
But she told those, first of all, she told those stories in another language. She didn't tell them in English.
Hmm.
And there's in some ways no way of translating the Armenian that I heard him in into the English, or for that matter, the Turkish into the English.
Hmm.
So, and she was obviously an immigrant. She fled a genocide.
Yeah.
She brought all that with her. So some of her storytelling, as I say in the book, is storytelling that was real, but I thought it was fairy tales,
Right.
giants in the hills catapulting rocks down upon passersby and so forth. She actually, during the deportation of the Armenians, her family was kept in the city of Sivas because my great grandfather was of great use to the Turkish leaders in the city, and he gambled with them and drank with them.
Hmm.
But but my great grandmother sent my grandmother, who was the oldest of about seven siblings, out into the hills to take supplies to some of the freedom fighters. So some of these stories she told me were clearly of her experience.
Yeah.
And I wish I could go back now and say, okay, just detail that a little bit. But she's gone. So, well, how many grandmothers do you get of that kind?
That's
Uh,
true.
the grandmothers and grandparents that may be able to pass on stories like that are actually immigrants into this country, and that would mean many Hispanics may well bring mythologies and fairy tales uh,
Hmm.
to a next generation. Um, but they'll become acculturated and Americanized very soon.
Yeah.
TV set was is and all the rest of it. Internet is so much more powerful than it was when I was growing up.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about, I think that it's already begun with the baby boomers, frankly.
Hmm.
Not entirely, but to a large extent. I say Disney kept us informed in some ways. The early Disney, the Walt Disney,
Yeah.
with heroic characters and even folktale characters in animated form and so forth. He was a reader of fairy tales,
Yeah.
um, and so he used the medium of movies and TV to actually tell the stories to us.
Yeah.
That's not happening today, though I suppose you could argue that in some of the fantasy productions, there are elements of Nordic or other mythologies, but they pale before the kind of awful stories that are perpetuated and inculcated in youth today. So you may be right. They don't have grandparents even now, I think. You're right about that. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's an aspect of modernity and post-modernity that we just forgotten our stories, which might suggest that we've forgotten who we are, and there's clear implications for that in the future.
Yeah. And you talk about that indirectly when you talk about the importance of proper self-authoring in the Pinocchio story, which we'll get to
Yeah,
in a bit. But
yeah.
I wanted to dig a little bit more into what you're talking about here at the beginning, especially Disney. If Disney did something good in preserving at least the outline of the old stories and providing us with visual images and some of the gist of what the old
How
stories
many
were.
children today know Pecos Bill?
Yeah,
But Pecos
yeah.
Bill is in my imagination, let me tell you. Okay. And it's because of Disney first. I then went and read the stories. I
Yeah.
remember I first saw it in Disney and then I read the stories. Yeah, go
So you
ahead.
think it
Thought.
so you think it's okay then that because you're necessarily and properly critical of Disney's retellings of some of the old stories, but perhaps just the fact that they made the stories in the first place and didn't completely destroy them uh,
Well, they are.
is good enough because then at least people go and read them.
You know where Disney's hand was. For example, in something like Snow White, he was near to the fairy tale. Yes, there were songs sung and the animals and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But that ending, he captured it perfectly,
Mm-hmm.
right down to the detail of the three birds that were watching over her grave. Those three birds, the owl representing classic myth, the dove representing Christianity, and the raven representing Germanic uh, myth and folklore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He probably recognized that that was the significance of those birds being there, whereas Disney today, I don't know. Now, somebody has read some of the Nordic mythology in order to do the what am I thinking of here? The one with the young women and a song I can't remember.
Frozen.
Frozen,
Yeah.
yeah. There's something going on there, particularly in the second Frozen. Actually, I think.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen the
Yeah,
second one. I've only seen the first one. I
I
was annoyed by the first one, so I stopped
well, they're
watching.
both annoying. They're terribly annoying. Those young women are just absolutely obnoxious. And I
Yes.
wouldn't want my granddaughter to be like one of
No.
them by any stretch. But my granddaughters, at least some of them, uh, dress up like those young women. So
Mm-hmm.
you that's really toxic.
Yeah.
And Disney today is toxic. I'm talking about the genius of Disney when
Yeah.
he read those. He'd read those stories. He'd lived with them. He had a reverence for them. I don't, when he does Pinocchio, for example, he changes the story. He doesn't use, but some of the concluding episodes, sort of Pinocchio, Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio,
Yeah.
and the character becomes an American innocent
Yeah.
and not an Augustinian bad boy.
Right. Right.
Still, I mean, there was a genius in it and a poignancy to it. And he couldn't do it today because Pinocchio gets kidnapped about 6 times and they wouldn't allow that anyway.
Well,
So,
he still he keeps the heroic quest in
yes,
it. You know, there's
yes,
still the journey into the underworld. There's still the coming through death. There's still the saving of the father. So you still
yes,
you
those
have some of
elements,
that. Yeah.
yes. And I
But
point out the differences
yeah.
and I do it relatively gently, although, I do think that even those retellings have some problems, but there's a difference between Disney's genius. My God, I mean, Disney's genius and what these people are doing. This is a corporate enterprise now, and what genius there is gets smothered by economics or whatever it might be. I don't know.
Yeah, the
And
bottom
we
line.
sell items after we produce the film.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's the
exactly.
major question that they're asking themselves.
Well, I my hope is that in the heart of that endeavor is its own death because you can't tell a story based on an economic bottom line and expect it to last for very long because people
Well,
are
in,
going to outgrow it eventually.
in a
Um,
second edition, in my preface, I mentioned Dickens'
yeah.
article that he wrote when he was outraged to see that his former illustrator was producing these cooked up fairy tales based on the originals, but in order to support the temperance movement. It was an
Yes.
ideological. So, so one of the things Disney says is in a utilitarian age, he uses that word. It's more important than ever that we keep the fairy tales intact.
Yeah. And I think people will catch up with that in time. The question still remains though, where are they going to go to find the stories? And this is a question that I keep coming across because whenever I talk about this subject with people who with fellow lovers of story, the question is always, where do I go? What do I read? And the question comes from this sense that we as Americans don't have a storytelling tradition, or not one as rich, as old as the Russians, the Armenians, any old tradition, culture from the old world, right? American myth is a strangely shifting thing. It could be any number of things. There's little, little inklings here and there of something unified, but it's you can't really talk about a unified American storytelling tradition, not really. So people want to know where to go, right?
Yeah.
So, and the answer too often to that is, well, there is no answer, because you can't go to the stories of other cultures, because then you'd be appropriating things that aren't your own, and you won't be able to understand them anyway, and they're
Right.
sort of hands off.
But
Um,
that's the insistence. If there's a criticism that the literary critics and other critics make of my efforts in this book is that I'm not cross cultural. I'm not doing comparative study. And my point is that these stories are the ones that really belong to us. And if we're going to enrich the culture and enrich our children's lives, we have to start there. And I'm the first one to say that, because I have a right to say that, because my first language wasn't English, it was Armenian.
mhm.
There was a fight in my house as to whether we continued speaking Armenian in the house, and my mother
Yep.
won, because her father also had strong opinions. My grandfather, who I did not know, I died when I was 1 year old. He died. He would bring Armenians into his home and teach them English immediately.
Yeah.
Point being, we're not stupid, and we don't want to look stupid.
Yeah.
We should be grateful for their having hosted us, where we came from. And thirdly, we want to succeed. So
Hmm.
learn English.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but I suffered for it. I have to admit, they weren't attentive to someone with a first language that wasn't English. But I don't gripe about it. I don't know. I think the system was probably better even still. I go through that suffering again because it forced me to learn English, grammar. You
Yes.
know, my father didn't give up. He'd come home, and he'd have me learning the alphabet and reading in an Armenian. That was his way of answering my mother's victory. Okay, so there it is. What can I tell you? Yeah, I know
Yep.
this resonates with some of your own uh, ethnic experience.
Yes. Even though I'm a third generation American, but
But
still.
still, yeah, still, yeah, right.
For the sake of those people who haven't yet read the book, could you talk a little bit about what is the moral imagination exactly? Where did you get the phrase, and why is it important to phrase it exactly in that way?
Well, the moral imagination as a phrase comes from Edmund Burke. And it was Burke thinking about what was happening in France, and that whatever that there was very little left in France that would form the moral imaginations of children, because of the world that was being created by the Jacobins and rationalism and atheism and all the rest of it. So, and of course, Burke was a great practitioner of metaphor, and the moral imagination, as he understood it, and some of the writers of the Scottish Enlightenment spoke of. They differed a bit about what it is, but the moral imagination takes form out of experience. Clearly, you don't have to be an empiricist to insist on that. Well, what kind of experience? Well, firsthand experience, real life experience, probably is the best. But children who don't have the opportunity for that kind of experience, worlds open up to them, and metaphors for life open up to them through literature. So they experience. You have an experience, and it goes to memory, and memory in some fashion, which is, I think, perfectly human, and no other creature has this. Those memories turn into metaphors that become resources for our interpreting our present time and experience, and morally so in particular. There are other kinds of imagination that I talk to. They're not very good. idolatrous, etc. imaginations, and they get formed too by bad stories and by terrible experiences that don't have some counter to them. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in the reality of today, when you're not allowed to have very often the the foundation, or rather the scaffold of a traditional reception of stories.
Mhm.
The problem of imbibing bad stories becomes very real because you don't know which one is good and which one's bad. And for a lot of adults, they don't even know the difference. They wouldn't be able to, because as you mentioned in the book, the way children approach stories is different than the way adults do. They're
Yeah.
not as traumatized by the violence.
No,
They're not as worried by the moral dilemmas as we parents are. So
it's
what?
because they live in a world of play.
Yeah,
Really, it is, and they know inside that play is play, but they can live out that play as if it were real life,
yeah,
and they don't like us adults interfering in that because they know that we've lost that. We can't play the way
yes,
they
it's
play,
true. It's true.
and a
It's true.
story told is another form of play for them. That's what it is.
Yeah. So how do we then, as adults, rediscover that sense of play? How do we cultivate a moral imagination in ourselves so that we can then give it to our children?
Well, the
Assuming we didn't get it as children.
Yeah, assuming you didn't get it as children, well, I suppose that's one reason why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't. That's not the reason, the primary reason why I wrote the book. But when I think about it, that it serves that purpose for a lot of people who I've met that have read the book. And I
Yeah.
had to tell you, it's utterly gratifying. I didn't know who my audience was when I wrote the book because
Hmm.
I knew there were homeschoolers out there. These were the people who were trying to bring literature into the lives of their children and story in a way in which I wanted other parents to be in earnest. Okay. Now we know what's happened since the 25 years ago when the first edition came out.
Yeah.
And we have a huge uh, revolution in education that's only beginning to really uh, be evident, which is the classical schooling movement, for example,
Yeah.
where story and narrative is extremely important, as is grammar and all the rest of it. So it has a place now that it didn't then, and it has a use now that I didn't anticipate, and the use is in part exactly to teach, for example, not just parents but teachers how to tell a story, even if
Yeah.
it's not their own story, but one they learned from
Hmm.
someplace else, to tell a story. And in fact, I'll be going to my grandchildren's school, my daughter's children in Charlottesville, their school. I'll be meeting in 2 weeks with the fifth grade. I will tell them some of my grandmother's stories,
Hmm.
and they will have had read to them the complete story of the Ugly Duckling, which is in the new book, which has been Baudelarized more than perhaps any other fairy tale I've ever come across. I mean, all the picture books are suspect,
Yeah.
particularly when they say it's a retelling. So I had the teacher. The teacher didn't know that either, mind you. That's the point. She doesn't know.
Yes.
So I said, I'm sending you the real story and a good translation. Now, if you want to show them pictures, get a picture book and show them the pictures while you're reading from the real story. And she did. She's going to do that. So when they come into the 45 minutes I have with the fifth grade, we will talk about the Ugly Duckling. But I will have the opportunity to discuss with them episodes in the Ugly Duckling, which are more attractive to children than the retellings, which are rather
Yeah.
dull-minded in my view. And you saw the arguments I make for the Ugly Duckling is not just merely about being the underprivileged or being goaded and so forth as a child. It's about a triumph of beauty. That is to say, the Ugly Duckling is driven by a love of beauty, and this becomes utterly manifest when he first sees the swans, not once but twice. It it's a very good fairy tale. But the point is that I'm going to be teaching, I've already begun to teach the teacher how to read a fairy tale. And then after that, I get a rest for about an hour or two. And then I meet with the entire lower school faculty, and we go over Cinderella, the Grimm Cinderella, it in its full sense. And I will lead them through it, and they will see how to read a fairy tale. And that's what has to be done now.
Yeah, you need to have mentors teaching
Exactly.
the teachers.
Yes.
So but that's, not everybody can have Dr. Vigen Guroian travel around the constantly teaching the teachers. So
I'd be glad to come. Those of you who are listening, would you please? I don't make a whole lot of money off of these books, believe me. And this book is sold more than most academics are. They could write 10 books and not have sold as many as the copies this book has, but it still doesn't make me rich. This book, this is an evangelical enterprise.
Yeah.
Show your friends the book. Talk to them.
Yes, please do. Absolutely.
Really.
So I really find it interesting that a lot of the stories that you present as being what you call the originals are in fact from 19th century collections or original works by 19th century writers. Who right, Hans Christian Andersen being constantly represented there. What does that mean is that, what does that suggest about the stories themselves? Did they need to go through the full process of being received through Western Christendom and achieve a kind of flowering in the 19th century before everything started to fall apart? Or is there still some value to the original, to the stories as they were told even before? Like if you were to go and find even older versions that, could perhaps be dated to thousands of years ago.
For example, the Grimm Cinderella is based on a reading of cross-culturally even of Cinderella tales. Okay, so but they relied principally upon the tales, the versions of Cinderella in the Germanic-speaking world. Okay, and yes, these were their creations in the sense that they drew scenes from this tale, this version of the tale, or the other, and this is a creation. It's quite true to the basics of the oral tradition. It's quite near to it, but they are creations. They're literary creations, and that's the second offense, because these literary creations are really, really among our greatest creations, literary creations. And these poor fools, well, they're not poor, they're getting rich by it, I suppose, rewrite these stories. What business do they have? We have business rewriting Dostoevsky. I mean, seriously.
Yes. Yeah. So you see them as the culmination of the best kind of scholarship, right? So these writers who compiled these stories and they took the best parts of them, and they were able to sort of distill the most, not authentic, but the most, I don't know, maybe authentic isn't the right word, but the best version of it, and present it in the most effective way.
We don't entrust these stories to just anyone.
Yeah.
Nor do they, when they get manhandled, do they normally come down to us the way that
that's true.
The Grimms and Andersen come to us. I can tell you a quick story. I was at a World Council meeting in South Africa, and I was appointed the master of ceremonies for a talent show of theologians gathered.
Oh dear! Oh no! That sounds dreadful.
It is terrible. What can you expect from a theologian? So there was a Danish woman there, and I'd gotten to be a good friend of hers, and she came up to me and said, "Vigen, what am I going to do?" And I said to her, I just thought for a moment, I said, "Can you tell a Hans Christian Andersen story?" She said, "Vigen, the genius, I not only can tell it, I carry him wherever I go." And she ran off, and she came back with a copy of Hans Christian Andersen.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
It is beautiful, isn't it?
Yes, we need more of that. That's for sure.
So no, these are exceptional individuals, and they've earned our trust.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
see, they've earned our trust, and the offense of Baudelarizing these, the way they're being done today for profit. Dickens was onto it in 1850. He already saw it coming. And so
So
one
is
of the
there,
projects of the book is to persuade people to read the originals, to be sure, and that's difficult because then parents and teachers ask me, where should I go?
yeah.
Well, you're probably going to have to go to collected editions of their work where you have reputable scholars in translating.
Yeah.
Find your
So
way.
let's talk about Pinocchio a little bit,
Yeah,
because
Pinocchio.
I find it very interesting that Pinocchio seems to be a right now at this cultural moment seems to be a kind of focal point. Uh, Jordan Peterson talks about him a lot. Jonathan Pajot talks about him a lot, and then Guillermo del Toro makes a Netflix series that is basically taking Carlo Collodi and inverting him completely and taking everything that
I
was.
haven't seen it, and I guess I don't
I,
want to see it.
I haven't either, and I'm not going to. But I read some of Del Toro's
But
musings on the
what's
subject.
his name? The comedian Bellini, but what's his name? The Italian Bellini. What's his?
Oh
Oh,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Not Bellini. What's his name? Yeah, I know who you're talking about. He did a film version. Yeah,
he did a film version, and he's done a second that I haven't seen. In the original
yeah,
film version, he is Pinocchio. In the
yeah.
second film version, he's
He's
Geppetto.
Geppetto. Yeah,
Right. Now, I'll tell you, that's much nearer. The first is much nearer to the Italian than anything that I've seen in print that has been a reinterpretation of Pinocchio or in film.
yeah,
And there's a darkness to it that is European and is clearly based in a tradition of tragedy. And
yeah.
where did Collard get his education? My God, he was reading he was reading Homer and and the Divine Comedy, and
For
that's
sure. There's a lot of Dante in there.
yeah, there's a lot of Dante in there, and they had to read it. You had to read Dante, right? So
So Del Toro talks about how his version is about the importance of overcoming the need for obedience and asserting the authentic self. So finding, basically, it's the old story of unlocking the goddess within.
yeah, well, you and I know, and probably your listeners know, um, that is almost a caricature of postmodernism.
Yes.
Frankly, the demon takes over these people, and I'm not talking merely metaphorically here.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, they are nihilists, outright nihilists,
Yeah.
and
No
if
doubt.
they show up where I am, I will punch them literally. I was a scrappy kid, and I was a gymnast, and I will beat the hell out of them. Okay, that's how I
Well,
feel
I mean the
about that stuff. I mean, that's
there
poison.
yeah. No, it is, and this is the point. This is the point. It's not by accident that they take the old stories, the good old stories, and tell them in a new way that completely changes the original meaning. Because, well, a lot of people haven't read the original Pinocchio, but had if people actually do read it, you will be astounded by the profound Christian message of nearly every single episode. And yes, it's very episodic and it's very 19th century and it's very picaresque and it gets a little bit the comedy, especially in the first few chapters, is particularly Italian. And I think
Yes, it
just
is.
to some children, it's perhaps not the not the best thing to read. Just with the old men hitting each other over the head over and over again.
And even the
Because my
Italian humor is not entirely translated. It can't be because it's idiomatic. I had a
yeah
couple of
yeah
nuns take my course one time, and they read it in the
uh,
Italian, and they reported on the various translations. There's no way.
yeah. I actually read it in a Russian translation, so I'm curious. I wonder how if it skews closer to the Italian or not.
Yeah.
But the yeah, I have a question here. Hold on, let me make sure I phrase it correctly. Oh yeah, the question that I wanted to ask was about self-authoring. I thought that a wonderful point you made
Mhm.
in this in your book is one about the story that Pinocchio tells himself about himself.
Yes.
Now, this is something that people are worried about a lot right now, right? Because in a world of values versus virtues, where you're told that you need to, not you need to, but you have the supreme gift of forming your own values and of authoring your own self. Um, Nobody seems to, those people that tell you that this is a wonderful thing don't seem to inform you of the fact that you are not an unlocked goddess, but you're a piece of wood, like Pinocchio.
Yeah.
And if you're going to author yourself through one of the many versions of this self-authoring that you can get, one of which, by the way, is offered by Jordan Peterson, which is, I think, interesting. But anyway, the version that you're going to come out with is going to be the first version of Pinocchio's own self-authoring, which is hilarious, completely nonsensical, totally messed up, and morally speaking, corrupt.
In the
So,
beginning, yes, absolutely.
yes,
Yeah,
in the beginning.
yeah, the first tries he has at it. Yeah, yeah,
I mean, it's hilarious to read it out loud
it
to
is.
my kids.
There's no
It's wonderful.
causality is all screwed up. It's yeah. It's I think kids can really appreciate it because he's making excuses for himself. He's blaming he's blaming the cricket for being smashed and all the rest of it.
By the way, I have not yet found the courage, and this is my fault, to actually read out loud that he kills the cricket. I keep skirting around the question, and I want you to tell me that I'm wrong.
You're wrong. I,
Yes.
I swear. I mean, take little boys. At least the ones I grew up with. They squashed a lot of crickets in their day, and worse. Now, if you read the entire story, they learn from that what they're doing is
Yeah.
not good. Okay, but at the moment, yeah, they're going to laugh probably. Well, he called me a donkey or whatever it was, so he deserved it. Whack.
Yep.
Yeah.
So in this, there does seem to be this obsession with nowadays with, because we don't have any authorities anymore, we don't have a tradition anymore, so the emphasis on self-authoring is prevalent everywhere. Is there something about that tendency that we can grab onto and help people do it properly, or is it just a bankrupt enterprise to begin with? Is this not something we should even be trying?
Well, the self-authoring that he does, if you want to call it that, I wouldn't call it that. I mean, and I'm not exactly sure what you mean by self-authoring because I don't read the people you read. I haven't even read Gordon Peterson. Well, my students
Yeah.
tell me all about him, and that's enough for me right now. Okay, so
Yeah.
what it is with Pinocchio, to just explain to everyone, he misstates, outright lies about himself in the beginning when he's forced to tell someone or other about what his activities have been and so forth and so on. And through the story, that narrative begins to change and becomes much more truthful and becomes utterly truthful when he's in the belly of the shark with Geppetto when he finally finds his father. But all of this self-authoring is given shape by a filial piety that is growing inside of him. So this self-authoring is not about making himself self by creating himself, but
Yeah.
rather about being able to be a good son to his father, for example. That's what it's
Yeah.
about, or a good brother to the blue-haired fairy. So it has a relationality to it and a
Hmm.
ground. It's vastly different than what a postmodernist says about creating, self-authoring.
Yeah. And I don't like to put it in that language either. I think it's very unfortunate. But would I be correct in saying that in some sense Pinocchio realizing or uncovering himself is less about creating something out of nothing, but it's more about matching a pattern to an archetype, or rather reflecting, more accurately reflecting reality as it is?
Yeah, but he also has help. And I guess
Yeah,
we could say that modern children don't have as much help as he had.
that's
Right.
true.
Even with the showman, um, he gets help. Oh, you're worried
Yeah,
about
he's not that bad of a character actually. You
no, he's
expect him to be a
not.
much worse
No,
character.
no, no.
Yeah,
The cat and the fox, now they're about as wicked as they get.
oh
Um,
yeah,
but he has help along the way. Our culture does not supply strong models the way they appear even in Pinocchio. So, but insofar as we're able to guide our children through it, that it's our imperative to be good parents in order for them to be good children and good people. And
yeah,
that's what happens with Pinocchio. He realizes that he has to be with his father. He mourns the death of his sister, the good-haired fairy. That's a poignant scene when he comes back to the house that he had visited, and the house isn't there, and she's in the ground apparently buried, though she reappears,
as
and
a
she
young woman.
weeps, and he says, "I wish it were me and not you." It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
it is. It's absolutely gorgeous. You talk about in chapter one about how fairy tales show us that there's a difference between what's logically possible and what is morally felicitous, between what is rationally doable and what is morally permissible. In fairy tales, the character of real law belongs to neither natural necessity nor rational determinism. Rather, real law is a comprehensible sign of a primal, unfathomable freedom and of a numinous reality and will. This is really very important what you're saying, and it's really, really interesting because if I'm reading it correctly, on the one hand, you're talking about how the presence of natural law, the presence of the existence of things as they are, is a source of freedom, not a source of limitation.
Right.
But on the other hand, in order to be able to teach that properly to yourself or to others, there is an element of coercion, just like the quote that you bring of Chesterton.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you resolve that? I mean, you can't resolve it. It's a paradox, and you have to live through it. But to somebody who is going to be antagonistic and is going to point to these things and say, "This is why we don't read these stories," how would you resolve it for them? For somebody who is perhaps not entirely pugilistic in their antagonism, but really wants to know.
Well, I suppose I would want to investigate what it is they really believe,
Yeah,
try to draw that out from them. And on the basis of what they say, I'd either make serious efforts to be persuasive or say maybe there's a gap between us that can't be bridged at this moment. I don't know. I mean, this is a bad time culturally. It's
yeah,
almost any statement is almost any statement seems to invoke a polarity,
yeah,
and that's because the foundational convictions that we proceeded with culturally have been really damaged, and some people non-existent anymore. So
yeah,
yeah, you're talking about a deconstruction. It's taken place.
yeah,
It has taken place and it's with us. So it's hard for me to know, I think, what to do except what I do. I mean, um, there are schools that are being formed that I think are important alternative to what the educationists today are insisting upon. So I think the public education system is gone as the norm any longer. I don't think in many states it will exist like it did for decades. And good riddance. In point of fact, I think my mother got a better education in Bronx, George Washington Heights, in George Washington High School, schooling with other immigrant children than even I
yeah.
did in the 1960s in Stamford, Connecticut, a superior high school, Stanford High School at that time, just in
Yeah.
terms of languages. Russian, Latin. They dropped Greek, but there was French, there was Spanish, there was German. Okay. And there was the rigor in it. All right. That was swept away by the 80s. And I think the greatness of American public education was probably somewhere between the 1920s and the 1960s. And they've been on, I mean, it's time for it to die as it was. And I think it will if federalism can hold up, if governors are willing to make it different, where people have, choice. New schools are going to arise. I mean, I've been down to Arizona many times. In those cases, even charter schools, Great Hearts schools. Yeah. I mean, that's the only realm in which I can participate where I think I make a difference. Forget the academy. It's just as well I left the academy. As my friend Stan Hauerwas said to me after I was, in effect, rooted out of UVA after 7 years with a big grant. He said, Vigen, it's a sick place. You're better off where you are. And he wasn't being dismissive. He was just being honest. So what he was saying, do what you do what you know best. You can do it now. You don't need to be in that world any longer. Yeah, that's where we are.
Well, and one of the more distressing manifestations of this deconstruction is something that I encounter even amongst people who should know better, people who are in a traditional culture, people who subscribe to traditional biblical religion, people who are educated, people who love stories. But you hear things like the great anathema for for a lot of modern-minded people is to suggest that there is such a thing as an objective standard when it comes to good stories, when it comes to the canon. And to such people, to even merely to suggest the presence of a canon, the existence of, or rather the goodness of a canon, of the canon, is something that's anathema because it goes contrary to personal choice. And I've been actually attacked in Orthodox circles by people who suggest that the received tradition, such as it is ethnocentric and is dismissive of the beauty of many small and diverse storytelling cultures that have never been able to see the light of day because of the monolith of what the West is. And it's very difficult to answer this kind of attitude with a loving word because you don't even have the same, you're not even standing on the same flooring, on the same footing. It's like you're in completely different places. Could you make an argument for the storytelling canon briefly? I know you do, this is the point of your book. But if someone were to challenge you on a stage in a place where you thought was safe and were to say to you, you are being ethnocentric, and it's a good thing that
the first response would be is that I was raised in an ethnos, and there are good things and bad things about an ethnos. So if you say if you're telling me I'm ethnocentric, tell me exactly how I'm being ethnocentric, because it may well be that you can correct me and that I'm still being ethnocentric in a negative sort of way, and I would like to be corrected, but tell me what it is. All right? There is particularity. There will always be particularity. A cosmopolitanism that dismisses particularity is a utopia.
Yeah.
I don't know where else to go with that one. I'm actually in a position to argue the case better than others because look, I can say, look, I mean, ethnocentric, I know what that is. I mean, my first language wasn't English, so I already knew that I wasn't like all the rest of them. And when I grow up and I was looked at as a white man, I had to say to these folks, I'm not a white man. In fact, when I was growing up, the Italians and the Greeks and we didn't think of ourselves as white people. Those were the Germans and the Irish and the English. Seriously.
Even the Russians don't. Even the Russians
No,
don't
even
think
the
of themselves
Russians
as white.
don't. So what is this thing between black and white that you're talking about? There's shades of
I don't know.
difference. What is it? First of all, if you walk into an Armenian church, you may well see a black person because we're in communion with the Copts and the Ethiopians. So cut it out, man. This is an American thing. I've said that. I've said that in the academy. What you're presenting me with is an American bias, an American distortion. You're not cosmopolitan. I am.
Yes. Well, you could say that. I couldn't.
Why couldn't you?
Well, because the person in question was higher up than I am. So
An
it
Orthodox,
wasn't.
I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, we've got problems in the Orthodox community, especially when our theologians and others start imbibing what's in the academy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to hope for Orthodox to be in the academy. I was one of the pioneers.
Yep.
I made entry long before most of them, or any of them for that matter. I used to attend Orthodox Theological Society meetings where I was practically the only layman. And on top of that, I was an Armenian, and they had to amend the Constitution to give me some sort of membership. Okay.
Yeah.
So give me a break.
You've made in your book and in our conversation, you've at least once made the connection between fairy tales and fantasy. Do you personally have any favorite fantasy stories, novels that you'd recommend people to read outside of the usual, Narnia and Lord of the Rings? Are there any hidden gems that you would
Yes,
recommend
there are,
people
but I don't
read?
know what they are.
Oh,
I've been told of them. I don't have time for all to cover a small piece of the corpus up to say 1950. Is it an enormous task? And Frank, and I'm not in literature. I'm a theologian. I've written books on ethics and theology. This is an avocation of some kind that's turned
yeah,
into a labor, really.
yeah,
So I know when people ask me what are the contemporary children's stories that I said I don't know them because my children are 40 years old now. I mean, I don't have the opportunity. What I can do is talk to you about stories that I have spent a lot of time with and that I know are of inherent value that you need to be aware of and be shown how to read. And that's where I go with that. No, I don't. I'm sorry. I can't give you anything to munch on
that's
there.
okay. That's okay. Do you think that there could be a good retelling of an old story?
Yes, but I wouldn't. I would say, name it something else.
Okay.
And name it something else with a byline, inspired by the
Mm-hmm.
great stories of the Grimms. Okay, if you want to give a shot at it, the likelihood is you won't come anywhere near the beauty of their stories and the depth of their stories, but go right ahead. And if you do have that kind of depth, then maybe you'll be in the canon someday.
Ah, what a beautiful word. That seems to be the perfect place to put a little bit of a pin in our conversation and allow people back into the room. I want to talk about many more things, but that was just beautiful.
Back with
Yeah.
you. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
God
Thanks
bless.
very much. Have a good day.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.